For the first time, Hezbollah has threatened to attack Cyprus. And the reason for this is that Cyprus is actively allowing both Israel and the West to use their airports to bomb the Middle East. And the leader of Hezbollah claims that Israeli fighter jets are taking off from Cyprus and are then bombing Lebanon. And he says that this makes Cyprus a legitimate military target as they are complicit in these attacks. Now, if Hezbollah was actually to attack Cyprus, it would likely bring in both the US and the UK. And then those countries would start bombing Lebanon. And this is because the Israeli fighter jets are taking off from the British RAF base in southern Cyprus. And so if Hezbollah was to attack, this British RAF base would likely be the very first target. And it goes without saying that if Hezbollah attacked a British military base, the West would probably start bombing Lebanon, especially considering this British base is used by most of the world as a gateway to the Middle East. Now, if the West actually started bombing Lebanon, it wouldn't be small strikes like what they're doing to the Houthis in Yemen at the moment. Hezbollah is incredibly advanced, and they could at least handle a small war against the US and the UK. But obviously countries and groups from each side would join into the war, and it would quickly turn into a regional war. And I'm not saying this to try and fearmonger. Hezbollah has actually threatened Cyprus, most likely the southern parts of Cyprus, due to their support for Israel. Except it's worth noting that Cyprus does claim that they've never allowed any other country to use their country to carry out attacks. Except this isn't true, as flight tracking clearly shows that British warplanes took off from there to then bomb Yemen. In Hezbollah's statement, they said Cyprus will become a part of this war if they open their airports to the Israeli forces. But if Hezbollah does attack, then I'll cover that in a new video. But separately, this is my weekly news recap where I summarise all of the news from the last week because it's very easy to forget what's happened. Staying in the Middle East though, on Thursday, Syrian air defense shot down a $30 million American drone. And footage of the wreckage went quite viral on social media, so it was really a big embarrassment for the US. The drone that was shot down was the American MQ-1C Grey Eagle drone, and it appears that it was shot down by Syrian air defense. And it's worth noting that this drone was shot down over the Deir ez-Zor area, and that's where all of the US military bases are. So it's likely that this drone was taking off from one of these US military bases, and then it was shot down shortly after. Now, technically, this is still classed as Syrian-occupied territory, and the US bases are on top of the Syrian gas fields. For example, one of the largest US military bases in the area is located on the Congo gas field. Except separately, you should know that Russia has been increasing their military and economic support for Syria over the last few months. And separately, if you had watched my previous videos, you would know that roughly 3 weeks ago, Russia held joint military exercises with Syria. And in those exercises, they tested out new Syrian and Russian air defense. So it's totally possible that Russian air defense that had been supplied to Syria shot down this American drone. Except it doesn't seem like the US is actually going to respond to this, as they haven't even issued a statement on it yet. Now, the last point in my last video, I quickly mentioned that Russia announced plans for Putin to visit North Korea. And last week on the 19th, Putin met Kim Jong-un, and he was met on the red carpet, and they actually hugged each other. And later that day, North Korea held a welcome ceremony for Putin. And in the afternoon, the important part, they had a meeting where they signed a strategic partnership agreement. And it seems that the two countries agreed on military and economic support for each other. And it's likely that this included North Korea providing military support to Russia to help them with their war in Ukraine. And some people also said that North Korea discussed potentially joining BRICS in the future. And in contrast to this, at the exact same time that Putin was meeting with Kim Jong-un, Joe Biden invited members of the LGBT community to the White House, seemingly to show how the West is more free than North Korea. So the East and the West definitely have conflicting ideas as to what they want the future to look like. Staying on North Korea though, it's been reported by basically everyone, citing the North Korean government, that North Korea will be sending troops to Russia for the first time ever. And these troops are going to be sent to the Donbass region of Ukraine to help Russia fight their war. And the US responded to this, and they said that these North Korean troops will be, quote, slaughtered. And the US Department of Defense said, if I were a member of the North Korean military, I would question the wisdom of being sent to participate in an illegal war in Eastern Europe. Although to my knowledge, questioning anything in North Korea isn't really a smart idea. Although separately, it's worth noting that the US and most of NATO have already accused North Korea of supplying both weapons and ammunition to Russia. But for the first time, North Korea has officially announced their military support for Russia. And another first time, this will actually be the first time that North Korea has ever sent troops outside of the Korean peninsula to fight a war. Now, the military units that are being sent to Ukraine are reportedly military engineering units, and they're going to be sent to the Donetsk region of Ukraine. Although these units will likely be doing the equivalent of what the NATO units are doing in Ukraine at the moment. They will most likely be helping the Russian soldiers from behind with their construction and delivery of ammunition, rather than actually shooting at the Ukrainian soldiers. And on top of this, these troops are expected to arrive just within within the next month. But with North Korea doing this, it does show that they're not afraid of the US or NATO. And it would suggest that North Korea now has a much stronger military than when they've previously fought wars with the US. Staying on Ukraine, last Sunday, Ukraine fired a missile at a beach in Crimea and killed at least 5 civilians and injured hundreds more, including women and children. Russia says the US is responsible for this massacre and they will get an answer. Now, the missile that hit this beach in Crimea was one of the newly supplied American ATTACK missiles, and they were recently controversially supplied to Ukraine. Now, what makes this even worse is that the US seems to be directly responsible for this attack on these Russian civilians. In order to fire the ATTACK rockets, you have to pre-enter the GPS coordinates of the target that you want the missile to hit. And because the US doesn't trust Ukraine not to just fire them at Moscow, the US enters in these GPS coordinates themselves. And at the same time this rocket was fired, an American Global Hawk drone was flying just off the coast of Crimea. And the rocket hit a beach in Sevastopol, southern Crimea, and it's exactly where the drone was looking at. So the US actively entered in the GPS coordinates of the beach that they physically saw was filled with civilians, and then they fired the rocket. And the Russian Ministry of Defense statement clearly says this as well. I'll read it out because it's obviously quite a big deal. They said, flight missions for American ATTACK missiles are programmed by American specialists using US satellite intel data. Therefore, the responsibility for the deliberate missile strike against these Russian civilians lies directly with Washington. And they also said, quote, these attacks will not go unanswered. Now, I do want to make clear this definitely isn't just a random attack that's been made up by the Russians. There are many similar videos with multiple angles of the attack, except they're obviously far too graphic for me to show on here. Now, it's unknown how Russia is actually going to respond to this American attack on their civilians, except it's likely to be a much larger attack on Ukraine to avoid escalation with NATO. Now, moving to Bolivia, on Wednesday, the leader of the Bolivian military ordered his troops to overthrow the sitting president. He ordered his troops to break into the parliament building and then take control of the country. In response to this, the Bolivian president called on all of the Bolivian civilians to rise up against this military coup and defeat the military. For a few hours, there was obvious fighting and violence and attempts to overthrow the government, but eventually the military coup failed. Videos show that the civilians listened to the Bolivian president and they rose up against the military, and the military then started running away from them. On top of this, many global leaders and global organizations quickly came to the support of the sitting Bolivian president as well. The Spanish president posted on Twitter and he said that Spain strongly condemns the military's movements in Bolivia. Now, as soon as the coup attempt failed, the same military arrested the same leader who gave them the order to overthrow the sitting president just a few hours earlier. Now, the question is, who is this president and who are his enemies? After October the 7th, Bolivia was actually one of the first countries to end their diplomatic relations with Israel. And the president has a very vocal support for the people in Gaza and not Israel. On top of this, he also expressed interest in joining BRICS after he went to the BRICS summit in St. Petersburg last month in Russia. And it's also worth knowing that Bolivia actually has the largest lithium reserves of any country anywhere in the world. And on a side note, the US was actually kicked out of Niger just 3 months ago, and it's rumoured that they were mining lithium there. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the US or Israel is behind this coup in Bolivia. I'm just saying that it would be in their interest to take control of these Bolivian lithium reserves. But regardless, the military coup attempt failed and the Bolivian president remains in power. Now, a few quick points. On Thursday, Russian President Putin met with the President of the Republic of Congo. In this meeting, Putin said that trade and economic relations between Russia and Congo are improving in a positive direction. And this is just another example of Russia expanding their diplomatic and economic relations with the countries of Africa. Now, moving to the Middle East quickly, last Sunday, Iran officially designated the Canadian Army as a terrorist organization. And the reason they did this is because the Canadian Army designated them as a terrorist organization too. Iran says that this move from Canada is a stupid act that is contrary to all international laws and regulations. But as far as the effects this is actually going to have on the world, it doesn't mean anything. One of the last points, Thailand has officially applied to join BRICS. Thailand says, we hope to be accepted as a BRICS member and then go to Russia for the next BRICS summit. But this is just another example of BRICS and the East growing economically. Separately, this final part is important, at least for me. I've now been demonetized across basically every single social media platform. And I wasn't provided with a reason for any of this, nor the option to appeal. It just all got taken away basically at the same time. And so if you want to help fund the making of these videos and the production of these videos, then you can go to alexbarnicoat.com and you can join my Patreon. And I'm not asking for loads, just instead of giving the BBC your money, maybe consider giving me your £5 a month instead. And you'll also get the cool feeling of supporting independent journalism. And for anyone that's interested, the sources for all of this information will be in the description below, along with my social media links, which you can probably see on screen now. But thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again at the same time next week.